Good afternoon to you all. I hope you had a good lunch. As they say in Ghana, we say in Ghana, when the politicians have belly full, they don't talk. But I will, because I'm hungry. Anyway, welcome to this session on examining the pathways to challenges to democratic transition and consolidation, and I believe it's in Africa. Today's session will examine how African countries can move from electoral democracies to inclusive political processes. As the internet and social media increasingly empower Africa's youthful population to become politically active, this session will advance the ongoing debates on democratic backsliding in Africa. It will examine some of the legitimate grievances that may underpin the rising insecurity and the citizen disillusion with democracy. Our distinguished panelists will explore the internal and external drivers of democratic backsliding in Africa and hopefully prefer focused and context-specific strategies to counter backsliding and promote stability in Africa. Well, each of you would have 8 minutes to give your initial remarks. I know some of you have told me 8 minutes is not enough, so I might be generous enough to give you 10 minutes. And then, hopefully, after your 10-minute remark, you'd have enough time to address other issues that you couldn't address during the Q&A and discussion session. Well, if you are following us on Twitter, the hashtag to tweet at is #PeaceBuildingAfrica. I'll be reminded that this discussion will be recorded and later on, will be recorded and webcast on Africa Up Close. Well, we have 3 speakers as usual, and our first speaker is Mr. Nhlanhla Ngwenya. He will speak on the internal and external contributors to democratic backsliding in Africa and specific strategies to counter it. Mr. Ngwenya is currently the Program Manager for Open Society Africa's Participation and Expression work. He was a former team leader for Information Democracy Pillar at OSISA. So take it away, Mr. Nhlanhla.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And let me, at a risk of having my 8 minutes cut, but let me also express my gratitude to SVNP for convening and hosting this discussion, in particular bringing together colleagues from various sectors, academia, civil society, activists / stone throwers in other terrains they've been called, funders and so forth. And I say this because the trend has always been that we engage in these difficult discussions in our own silos, and we don't really sort of share ideas and strategies. And I'm hoping that these conversations will result in multi-sectoral engagement and responses to some of these challenges. I was going to say, when I saw the invitation, and I remember I was talking to my programs director when he was talking about this event, and I said to him, but we have sort of litigated on these issues on a number of occasions on what is causing the backsliding on the continent. And then he said, but there is no harm in repeating that so that we don't forget. So I'm hoping that what I will say, some of which may have been said in the last 2.5 days when I was not present, but I think going back to the advice I got, there is no harm in having them repeated so that at least they don't fall through the cracks. I think what really has been a challenge coming from, I think, civil society, because yes, we are Open Society Foundation, we work with civil society, we fund civil society work. In our own understanding and our own diagnosis, what is really a challenge here on the continent is aptly encapsulated by a French poet, Charles Peguy, who says, tyranny is always better organized than freedom. Tyranny is very agile. It is adept. It analyzes the terrain. It identifies threats, and then responds accordingly. And the danger that, and the problem that I have witnessed and we have witnessed as a team is that we are often slow to respond as tyranny responds or regenerates itself in so many ways on the continent. And to aptly aptly describe the challenges that we are facing when it comes to democratic governance here is our hybrid regimes largely anchored on competitive authoritarianism. They give you a facade of democracy. They will have all the institutions that will tick the box when it comes to assessing whether they are a democratic state or not. They will have parliament, they will have elections, they will have they will have the courts and so forth. But in reality, those institutions are symbolic. They do not really help in terms of defending the democracy. And why is that so? Because of years of systematic capture and weakening of the same institutions. And it starts with the elections. I'm happy that early this morning, colleagues were talking about elections and whether it's still necessary to have elections in Africa. I have a different take. As long as we don't have an alternative to electoral democracy, we need to fix what is broken. Otherwise, you will plunge Africa into a huge continent of conflict. There is no other better alternative. And this is also supported by many surveys that have been conducted on the continent, which still affirm the validity of electoral democracy on the continent as the best form of governance or the best pathway to attaining power and legitimate authority from the people. So it starts with elections. We've seen, I don't have to repeat quite a lot on that. And what we are witnessing right now are electoral coups. At lunch, I was talking to a colleague about the typologies of coups, and often we only focus on what is happening in West Africa. But how about constitutional and electoral coups that are characterizing our governance systems in the region? Electoral coups, you go for elections, but you know that those that wield power will emerge victorious. They will subvert the process, they will manipulate the process, they will actually pack up the electoral commissions with their own people who announce non-existent figures. And then they will tinker with figures until you easily forget about it. And then you go to court and the courts will still rule in their favor. That's an electoral coup because they are not deriving their authority from anywhere else, but from the institutions they control, the institutions that they have captured. But for them to continue living, to continue in power, they also need to control the narrative. And if you come from Southern Africa like I do, you know the increasing liberation war narrative that is taking place in dominating our public discourse. Even the ANC itself, I think in the last month or so, they are whipping up the anti-apartheid struggles and centering them as the cause for poor service delivery in this country. And this is the same topic. You go to Mozambique, liberation movements are very good at doing that. You go to Zimbabwe and so on. So you control the narrative. To control the narrative, you have to curate the information. You have to control the public media. You have to also buy into the private media, which is a new trend that we are witnessing in the region. You use your proxies who appear to be independent in the face of the public, but then they are actually linked to the ruling elite, and then they control the narrative. And when the propaganda comes through, propaganda and disinformation comes through the so-called independent media, it is bound to be believable. Because this is the media that is often viewed as that which provides alternative propositions, alternative information, and robust criticism. So there is a growing trend that is taking place. Of course, the patronage networks, because you can't withstand public pressure without oiling the networks that will sustain you. So there are patronage networks, they will get tenders, they will get government appointments here and there, and then the profits that they get from these tenders go back to support the same system. It is the same profits again that will support the parties that are in power, support the leadership that is in power. as well as support the personal and private interests of the ruling elite, scholarships for their children, and a whole lot of things, building houses for their cronies and so forth. And another point, again, that I mentioned was slightly the entitlement of liberation movements that we are witnessing as well. I think I mentioned this earlier on, but this entitlement is such that those that have come from the liberation war feel that they are entitled to rule and entitled to access national resources without any reproach from citizens. They cannot be criticized. They cannot be voted out of power. They should rule forever because they went to war and liberated the continent. That sense of entitlement has also poisoned our democratic struggles. And of course, there were hints earlier on around the weaponization of the law to crush dissent and opposition. And this weaponization is also online. I heard earlier on colleagues hazarding and surfacing the opportunities that online platforms are presenting to the struggle for democracy. Yes, that's true. We can't deny that. We have seen it in action in a number of countries that we work in as Open Society Foundation. But the converse is also true. Like I mentioned earlier on, tyranny is better organized. We are now in an era where we are witnessing the adoption and enactment of laws to specifically target online activism, to criminalize online activism. We are now talking about repressive regulatory frameworks for the usage of online tools. I mean, look at Uganda, their colleagues from Uganda who can testify to that. Look at how they are throttling the internet every time there's a protest in the region, every time there's an election and there's a hint around parallel voter tabulation, the internet doesn't function because they know there's going to be real-time tabulation of results to poke holes into what the official commission often would rather announce. And the one other thing again about online and offline. Yes, there's so much glorification around online as an opportunity, but the truth of the matter is the rights you don't enjoy offline, you cannot suddenly enjoy them online. If there is terror offline, there will be terror online. And this we've witnessed again, where in some instances, states don't have to enact new laws. They are basically using legacy laws, traditional laws, to criminalize activism online. So there is need to exercise caution when we actually are talking about the online spaces as the new zones for activism. There is also danger there. And as well, there's the ethnicization of politics, and I don't need to say much for those that live on the continent. You know, when you gain power, your people from the village, from your tribe, 50% of your cabinet is made up of those that come from the same ethnic group, and the emergence of political dynasties. I mean, your daughter, your son becomes the advisor here and there, and then 2 ministries to your wife or your son, and all that it is to ring fence the one that wields power, insulate themselves from threats from outside. But what is the glue to all this? It is the illicit financial flows. The murky exploitation of resources by the ruling elite, the corrupt networks, not only in our own countries, but globally. How are they managing to extract the minerals from the continent, sell them outside, bring the dirty money back to fund their own interests without detection if there are no international enablers? And these are some of the challenges, and these are some of the issues that I'm hoping that as we sort of distill these issues, we can come up with practical means to curb all those networks that are oiling autocracy in a number of African countries. And because of the monopolization of all the spaces by those that wield power, we are beginning to see collusion between capital and as well as dictatorships on the continent. For one to have business, you need to grease the palms of the leader. You need to work with their networks of corruption for you to get a tender, for instance, for you to run a business, and so forth. And we've often heard that business actually, when you do your advocacy and say, but can capital also play a part in the fight for democracy? They'll tell you that capital wants stability. So it doesn't matter what kind of stability that is, as long as capital is happy. I understand is it 1 minute or 7? Okay, it's 1 minute. So there are quite a number of other points. I think we can talk about them during plenary. But I think one of the key points, before I sort of quickly go through what I propose could be the way forward, it is the militarization of politics and politicization of the military on the continent. We're increasingly seeing the involvement of the military in civilian politics on the continent. I mean, we saw it during COVID, where we're told COVID is going to ravage Africa, therefore the military was supposed to come in and enforce the COVID restrictions. Every time there's a protest in a number of countries, the military is brought in and so forth. So there is an increasing increasing involvement in civilian life, and resurgent religiosity again on the continent, where leaders are ordained by God and therefore should not be challenged. And these faith groups are closely linked to the anti-rights groups. And we have seen when you talk about LGBTQI issues and how politics and religion come sort of coalesce around some religious teachings to erode those freedoms. And of course the external, I'm almost done. I think quickly it is really the double standards in the foreign policy of developed democracies when it comes to human rights and democratic issues. The weak regional and ineffectual oversight bodies, SADC, AU, UN, and of course what is bedeviling the whole globe right now, the geopolitical dynamics that are playing out following the Ukraine-Russian war, and how there are realignments, especially on the continent, on which side and which geopolitical power to align with, which also has an impact on our democratic standards and norms. And of course the rise in the right-wing politics in developed countries, which is actually fortifying autocratic rule here on the continent. Perhaps I'll talk about solutions at plenary. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nhlanhla. You've given us a lot to think about, a lot that is wrong with our democracies, a lot that is leading to what we are calling the backsliding of democracy in Africa. Many of what you say, for me, goes back to what we are seeing now in the literature and amongst us think tanks as what we are calling democracy capture. It's where you have every semblance of democracy, where you have elections, and yet there's everything wrong with the governance. You have a few elites who capture what we believe as citizens as democracy, what you call those who oil the machinery of corruption, of capturing the judiciary and all of that. It's present, and I think that is one of the things that we have to begin thinking about. How do we tackle this issue of people who capture what we believe to be democracy in Africa? I'm going to move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker would give his remarks on... Sorry, I missed. Chuku, what are you talking about? I can't find your topic. That's strange. No. Well, Chukwu Emeka is executive director of the West Africa Network for Peace Building, WANEP. He manages a strategic partnership between AU, ECOWAS, WANEP, and by which WANEP provides early warning data and analysis and assessments and recommendations. Chukwuemeka, doctor, please speak on your topic. I can't seem to find it.
Wonderful.
Or would you make one up?
Wonderful.
I think you should make one up.
I was telling us that I'm coming to speak, and unfortunately, I don't know what I'm speaking on. So, but
oh,
thank
no.
you,
Wait,
thank you, my
I found
brother.
it. No, I will rein you in. Don't worry. So, Dr. Eze is speaking on the challenges the challenges democratic transitions face, including violence surrounding elections and political transitions, and means of mediation and conflict prevention during these transitions.
Okay. Anyway, thank you so much, my brother. You gave me confidence at 2 levels. Number one, discussing the key issues that are fundamental to African democracy, but also the confidence to stand on this podium and be seen, because I wasn't sure whether people on the other side would see me. In the past, I have talked about 3 paradoxes in Africa. Number one is the fact that, especially in countries in West Africa, the early stages of the rebel group movements, international community wanted to support Africa to save the state from those that wanted to take over the sovereignty of the state. But today, people are no longer interested in the state. They either want a state of their own, or they even want to leave the state for you. The second thing is that even those that clamored for freedom are now happy to migrate back and be enslaved voluntarily. But I think that today we can begin to add some other paradox. The first one is what we have seen in recent time, which is, quote and unquote, the celebration of military incursion into politics, which a lot of people, including some of you in this room, fought very hard to put behind us as history. The other thing is also the romance, and I think, my brother, you spoke about it already. The romance that existed between the colonial masters and the African states. That romance is now being challenged to the extent that it is now bitter. So I don't know the opposite of romance and what you can replace that with. But if you begin to look at the state of play of democracy in Africa today, like he rightly stated, I think we basically have 2 types of stability in Africa: consolidated autocracy, consolidated democracy. But somehow, just like he said, our international partners are comfortable with it too, so long as it does not affect the mutual interests between the African states and the other rogue states. However, what is happening is that there is, in many places, in many states, a movement from that consolidated autocracy to consolidated democracy. And that's why we are getting a lot of shocks with our democratic experiment, including, of course, the strengthening of the state institutions that in the past were in the hands of these individual autocrats. So the question then to ask is, how our normative frameworks working? Are they still fit for purpose? Are they still able to guide and guard democracy in Africa? Just at the launch last month in Nairobi of the AFSIT, the Africa Facility to Support Inclusive Transition in Africa, President Obasanjo did ask whether the things himself and Thabo Mbeki and a group of others organized at a time as regime sanctions, whether they are still fit for today's democratic challenges. If not, why do we continue to invest and use them as a deterrent to restoring and sustaining democracy? So we need to answer that question, not just whether the normative frameworks are still fit for purpose, but whether even the institutions that are the custodians of those normative frameworks need to rejig itself. Because people are looking at African Union and asking, so what is your worth? People will look in the direction of SADC or ECOWAS or IGAD and say, what can you do for us? So if states and citizens are beginning to question the institution that is supposed to guard and guide democracy, then there is a problem. Because we now need to make a difficult choice whether we still want to continue with multilateralism or we want to go back to our different nation states. I think also, and I said it yesterday, that even the UN needs to introspect. And beyond even introspection, also shed weight. Because part of what they are saying on the streets of Niger is that ECOWAS cannot intervene without a UN mandate. Who provides the UN mandate? That's the Security Council. What is the morality of the Security Council to provide such mandate to restore democracy in Niger? What is the composition of the Security Council? How democratic is the Security Council to be able to give a mandate enabling ECOWAS to intervene the way it wants to intervene in Niger? I think that our method of dialogue needs to change. For a long time, we have been speaking amongst ourselves as Africans. At what point do we engage our bilateral partners and multilateral partners? Not as the movement of 54 countries to Turkey for Africa-Turkey summit, but as partners within the global community that is looking for global peace and democracy. And what is the standard of democracy that we need to practice? If we agree within the global community that we don't have a global standard for democracy, then let's come back to Africa and begin to discuss an organic democracy that will fit the purpose of African states. But if we are using a prism to look at democracy, if we're having a standard, then let's have a global standard and hold each other accountable for not applying those standards. I think also that part of what I've been asked to talk about is also to look at our mediation protocols when it relates to, as it relates to transitions. The question then is, who constitutes the African mediators? The Panel of the Wise, the Council of the Wise, FEMWISE. I hear there is now the existence of YouthWise. Who are those? Are they the same African leaders that messed up the states in Africa that are now going to speak to their peers? Sometimes I feel they are just being used as Panel of the Wise to sustain their lives so they don't die quickly and continue to mess up Africa. So how do we have the moral standard of those who constitute the Panel of the Wise, of who mediate even transitions? What applications are we making? When you have a sitting president that have been through coup d'etat or unconstitutional change of government, removed from power, why are we negotiating transition and election? Why are we not returning the person that have been seated? If we are saying that the person is no longer fit for purpose, why did our intergovernmental organizations allow it to get to that point when only through unconstitutional means the person is removed? So the question the people of Guinea is asking ECOWAS and African Union is, where were you when President, what's the name of it? Conde, when were you when he changed the constitution? The same question they are asking the international community. You are looking at Alassane Ouattara change the constitution of Côte d'Ivoire, even when he fought against the same under President Gbagbo. So at what point do we really say this is unconstitutional change of government? Is it only when there is a coup d'etat or when presidents through the National Assembly or through the parliament, dominated by his own party, change the constitution to still in a term limit, a new term limit? So what that means is that the continental plan of action needs to be negotiated. It needs to be negotiated, not in terms of what the Agenda 2063 is saying, but in terms of the new cries and shouting of the African youth on the streets of Niger, Burkina Faso, Gabon, and so on and so forth. What are they asking? They are asking for new negotiations between African states and their former colonies. They are saying that it is no longer fashionable for Mali to continue to pay rent for the seat of the presidency in Paris when they can even build their own. They are saying that Niger cannot continue to be told how to export its natural resources. So these new cries and shouts on the streets is what will form on the basis of new negotiations with our counterparts. And that is beyond just Agenda 2063. The African solution to African problem, which indeed is supposed to be very fantastic, needs to be also reviewed. Because African states need to also take responsibility. The leadership in Africa needs to take responsibility. You can't be talking about African solution to African problems with somebody else's resources. On the basket fund of the Africa Peace Fund is people's money. How can you use that to effectively engage in what you call African solution to Africa problem? One thing I hate is to be stopped when I'm saying something. So I want to stop myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Eze. You raise a lot of issues, many that raise additional questions for, I think, all of us. And for me, the shortest one I have is it a lost cause in terms of the ECOWAS and the AU? But you don't have to answer now. And also, I mean, if elections are supposed to usher in what we call democracy, and what we're supposed to benefit from a democracy, what is really wrong with our elections? Why can't our elections produce the right leaders? And when it comes to issues of regime structures, you said they are not fit for purpose. So what's the alternative? Anyway, so we'll move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Ms. Tseke Kasambala. She will speak on building inclusive political processes and the legitimate grievances that may underpin rising insecurity and citizen disillusion with a democracy. Ms. Tseke Kasambala is Director of Africa Programs at Freedom House. She has over 20 years' experience working in East and Southern Africa on human rights and democracy and governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me try and put my phone here so I don't go over time. Thank you to the organizers for convening this platform. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm at the risk as the last person of repeating exactly what my colleagues have said, but maybe I'll say it in different language and hopefully add some new and unique insights into this debate that has been going on for a while now. So I think, let me begin by alluding to an interesting statistic, which was actually released, part of a global survey that was released by the Open Society Foundation a few days ago, which spoke about 86% of respondents across the globe preferring to live in a democratic state, but younger people being less likely to believe that democracy would be able to deliver and address their concerns. And that's the paradox that you've been speaking about, my brother, that we're living in a time where the broader populace believes in democracy but does not believe that it can deliver when it comes to democratic dividends. And so what do we do about that? I've been asked to speak about building inclusive political processes and the legitimate grievances that underpin disillusionment and disenchantment with democracy. I'll start with the latter because I think it's very important. And you excuse me because I think I'm coming down with a cold. My organization, Freedom House, which releases its annual Freedom in the World report that assesses the state of civil liberties and political rights, speaks about the 17th year of regression globally when it comes to democracy. 17 consecutive years. So our continent, Africa, is not unique at all. But I want to speak to some of the unique aspects of that global democratic decline in Africa. 5 of our heads of state have been in power for over 30 years. This is an interesting fact and a very important fact. Over half a dozen of them have been in power for over a decade. Another interesting fact. Ali Bongo of Gabon, the deposed Ali Bongo of Gabon, had just won a highly flawed election that had given him a third 7-year term in power after his father, who passed away and led that country from 1967 to 2009. What is underpinning these legitimate grievances? What is making these coups so popular? Those are the statistics. When we speak of other numbers, and another interesting fact that the Freedom in the World report speaks to, is the fact that only 8 African countries are designated as free, and then Eritrea, Sudan, Equatorial Guinea, Central African Republic, Somalia, measure amongst the 10 least free countries globally. When it comes to opposition parties and opposition politics, the indicator that we use that measures political opposition shows that 16 countries measure, the score is 0. So 0 being the lowest and 4 being the highest when it comes to political opposition. Which means that 1/3 of the continent's countries lack the space for opposition parties to gain power. What is underpinning these grievances? There are a lot of important facts that have been spoken to by my brothers, including geopolitical influence, foreign interventions, the continued neo-colonial aspects of how our countries are governed and how they're run. But we have to look at ourselves internally and see how we are disenfranchising our young people who form the majority of this continent. The ones, if you're going to talk about building inclusive political processes, and you disenfranchise the largest percentage of the people who are likely to take our countries forward, you are going to get disillusionment and disenchantment. And we'll see the return, which is what we're seeing now, to the 1970s and 80s of increasing militarization and the gun being seen as a solution to our problems. I wanted to make a few other points of note. The first one is the relatively weak institutions that Nhlanhla spoke about, in the absence of a democratic culture, have facilitated the ability of incumbents to manipulate our constitutions. We've spoken about that. There's a misperception that all democracy requires is the regular performance of elections, but we know that it means more than majority rule. Free and frequent elections as a constraint to government tyranny are a necessary but not sufficient condition to guarantee and guard our liberties. And whilst elections have helped us consolidate, deepen, and entrench democracy, they have also paved the way for sustaining majoritarian power to the detriment of the minority, as we have seen in many countries. And I'll speak to Cameroon as one example, where a significant minority has been excluded from the political process. Although elections are critical to the transition of a country from authoritarianism to constitutional democracy, they can also serve, and they are serving, as a tool for the survival of authoritarian governments. And we've seen this across the board, more recently now in Zimbabwe, where highly flawed elections took place. International observers, including SADC, surprisingly enough, despite all the criticism, came out and spoke to the flawed nature of those elections. So reversing the trend, it is not enough to just speak about democracy and elections. We need to do more to be looking at what are the root causes of the conflict. What are the legitimate citizen concerns related to socio-economic conditions, disenfranchisement, and governance, as well as the accompanying rights that are fueling the types of insurgencies we're seeing in parts of West Africa and the Sahel? What are the democratic deficits that need to be addressed related to issues of corruption? Particularly, I want to speak about impunity. The cost of repression across our continent is not high enough. The African Union and the regional economic communities, the international community, the wider international community has not done enough to increase the cost of repression. And repression goes beyond what we're seeing in terms of violent conflicts, but repression through elections as a means of entrenching oneself in power. In my final minute, I want to speak about the role of civil society and citizenry. There are numerous great examples of citizen participation in political processes through peaceful protests as one. We saw that with the End SARS movement in Nigeria. We have seen it in Senegal. We saw the young women and men of Sudan removing al-Bashir in 2019. And yet, we go back to our leaders because citizens are pushing for greater inclusion in political processes. Citizens are pushing and actively engaging in civic engagement. But the pushback is very, very real. So I do believe it's not enough time for us to go into solutions in these 8 minutes. Like my colleagues, I think it's important that we have that discussion in plenary. What is the way forward? How do we address this? How do we make the actions that citizens, take actually deliver in terms of tangible results that actually benefit them? I am not one for romanticizing this notion of a democracy that actually fits African needs, because I don't think democracy has been practiced as it should in many places, including the continent. And so I always push back on those types of discussions. Yes, there's a need to reconfigure. Yes, there is a need to analyze the concept of democracy, but let's not fool ourselves. It's not being practiced as it should, and it's not delivering for its citizens. Thank you. Was I given 10?
Yeah. Oh, I gave you 10. Anyway, thank you very much. We've heard from all three speakers. I think we've been having these discussions since Monday about democracy, whether democracy is fit for purpose for Africa, whether we should call it democracy at all, we should find something else. Weak institutions have also been mentioned by all three speakers. I see that, in Africa, one of the problems we have is that we did not develop our institutions. We just supplanted what we call democracy onto weak institutions. Take a country like Liberia or Sierra Leone, coming from a post-conflict country. What institutions did Liberia have before, getting on this bandwagon called democracy? And so those are some of the questions. They are legitimate. And I'm now going to open the floor for questions and comments, and then I'll throw that back to the discussants, and then we'll take a final round so you can, round up your solutions to the big problem we have in Africa. And as usual, just put your tent card upside down so you can be recognized. Sorry. Yes, yeah. Sign language, I don't comprehend. All right, so Dr. Barry.
Thank you for the excellent presentations, and thank you for the opportunity. I just want to make, a reflection or an opinion. with the phrase itself, democratic backsliding in Africa. I think if we are going to say democratic backsliding, perhaps the undertone or the implicit understanding is that democracy was moving forward, but at some point in time, we have stagnated, and now we have started to backslide. If that is the understanding of backsliding, then would this be a correct characterization of Africa? Are we really backsliding, or we were in a continuous state of regression? I think that's very important. Because if I can take the example of Ethiopia, where I am from, for instance, in 2015, I think it was in 2015, when President Obama came to Addis, he declared that the incumbent was a democratically elected government, and he made that very strongly. He made that comment in a very strong way. But that comment came right after, when the incumbent controlled 100% of not only national parliament, but all regional parliaments. And President Obama knew that for a fact, and he was bold enough to declare the government a democratically elected government. Fast forward in 2020, when war broke out in Ethiopia, and we fought for some 2+ years, where an estimated 1.5 to 2 million people died out of that conflict in the north only. We are not counting conflicts in other parts of the country. The Prime Minister was invited after the conclusion of the war in the north. Our Prime Minister was invited to the US-Africa Summit, and he was privileged to sit very close to President Biden, and he was watching the World Cup with him. So I think we need to put that into context. Who is and what is the standard of when we are saying democratic backsliding, the democratic regression, progression? Perhaps now there is the West African problem, and that's very alarming for the West. And they probably, I'm not saying conclusively, probably, they want to use this democratic backsliding term for a reason that gives absolute meaning to their interests, strategic or whatever. Now, this democratic backsliding or democratic regression, does it give meaning to us Africans in the way that it is defined? Sometimes it does not give me sense in a way that we know where we were, we know where we are now, perhaps we know where we are heading, but we don't have the voice, the capacity to really describe our own backsliding in our own way, our own progression in our own way, or our own regression in our own way. We're not the standard setters. Somebody sets the standard, and then we say, oh, military coups are emerging in Africa, and that's bad for us. Or electoral authoritarian and stuff. So I think the important thing to recognize that, have we chosen the road that we want to travel, or somebody has already chosen the road for us and we're just flowing through that road? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all the presenters. You kept us awake when we were at a state of hypoglycemia, which is quite good. I just have a few comments. I really have informed my thoughts. Ntlantla, your presentation was quite interesting, talking about what is private becoming owned by the politicians. But I just want us to reflect and say that, is it not because of how small, of a narrow base of assets, of productive assets that we have in the continent, which then links us to economic development. Why am I saying that? Let's give an example of Russia, where the oligarchs are, which means there are also a few, they are easily captured, but then give the examples where these private assets are meant, they become difficult to capture. Perhaps that could be it. My thoughts is not very well formed. And then you brought in a very interesting issue. But the question that begs from your question, should we always condemn coups? Should we? I mean, look at the issue of Niger and how France, all the Francophone, how these have been exploited by France. Again, the question that you brought in is quite interesting. People say the AU cannot intervene. Let's go to the UN, which is the UN Security Council, where France can veto. And I mean, this is the typical case of being the player, the ref, the match commissioner, and the spectator for France. Yeah, and a VAR judge. So why is the sense in that? I think the academics in those countries are sleeping if they have not told the people that are there. I'm sorry to being that crude, but I don't know what will be your reflection on that. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you to all the speakers for the provocative presentations, and also to the colleagues who have raised some very important and provocative questions so far. Mine is also a comment. Mine is a question. I was very interested in the concept of democratic capture. Here in South Africa, we have just recently come through a traumatic process where a litany of contradictions were exposed that really led us to an understanding and findings as a result of a judicial commission that over the past 10 years there had been a systematic pattern of what was described as state capture. So my question is, in the context that this democratic capture was or has been identified, are there common features? Because in the South African context, and it really is contested, because it gets to the very same question that the colleague who's spoken earlier has raised, and that is, what may look like capture to you is, in views of some, genuinely a sense of trying to redirect the policy, political, socio-economics to redress. So there's a kind of legitimation on the one hand of those who reject the notion of state capture, and therefore I would say, perhaps in those other contexts, there's a rejection of the concept of democratic capture. And to circle back to my question is there a kind of common thread of what the features of democratic capture are, and how contested indeed is the notion? Are there perhaps those very instances where it is really genuinely felt that doing things in this way is the African way and it is right, and we are actually trying to redress historic wrongs?
Or do you want to respond? Maybe we'll respond to this first set of questions, and then we'll take the next set of questions. But let me quickly address the question you asked. Well, democracy capture is what we are beginning to identify as a subset of state capture. So in South Africa, for instance, it will be the issue of the Guptas, for instance, how they managed to, do things. I don't want to get into it. You would find similar examples in Benin, for instance, where the current president was a typical financier of the political parties. Then he finds himself, in politics himself, he's controlling the state in a way, but he's using the roots, the democracy roots. Some mentioned Tinubu in Nigeria as well. You find that in Mozambique as well, where the journalists are arrested when they try to report on the president's family issues and that sort of thing. So this is a situation where a few elites, business colleagues, kind of circumvent the system to their advantage. They bend the rules. They put cronies in positions of power in the judiciary. They capture parliament somehow as well, so that when the laws and policies are being passed, it's to their advantage. So it's something we are studying, and that's how we are seeing it, that it's what is bending democracy, as it were, in Africa, that although democracy seems to be working, there are some things that work to disable it in a way, and we think it's democracy capture. It's a subset of state capture. Democracy capture cannot work without the state being captured. Dr. Eze, would you answer your question first? Or
Okay. I think this is exactly what I was saying when I was talking about listening to what the people on the streets are saying, as opposed to what we assume are the standards. I will not, at any time, encourage coup d'etat. I think that those of us coming from West Africa should be in a better position to talk about coup d'etat. For two reasons. Number one is that for every time we have had military incursion into politics, the things they say they want to write, they never write them. And they end up setting us many years back. At least in many instances, we have not seen, and I'll give you an example of Mali. I think I said it yesterday. At some point, I had a meeting as the head of ONEP with the vice president of the transition in Mali. And he asked me, why is it that ECOWAS is more interested in organizing an election rather than their security? And I remember clearly that what they said when they were coming into power is that the country was being surrounded and being taken over by extremists, and they can no longer fold their hands. We have had more advancement of the extremists to Bamako than when the civilians were in power. The level of non-accountability that goes with them is too high. But I hear you very well. Because what these people are celebrating, and I said it yesterday, is not a military regime. They are tired of bad governance, and anything to disrupt that particular regime is fine, even if it meant France coming back to colonize them. They would have still gone to the street probably to celebrate. Anything other than this particular one that we are not seeing the dividend is fair enough. So it's not really a celebration in favor of the military, but they were tired of this bad governance, and they wanted something to disrupt it. Now, do we need to wait until there is a coup d'etat before we start running around? My answer is no. And that's why I said that we need a introspection. Our intergovernmental organizations that are supposed to guard and guide the conduct of democracy need to define what they consider to be the parameters. And I think that's exactly what my brother is saying. That look, whether we are calling it, in fact, last year we called it democracy decay. I know that my English teacher was an Indian, but I didn't find that word funny. Democracy decay in Africa. I didn't find it funny. But the truth of the matter is that if we need to make a choice, are we going to have global indicators for what democracy should deliver or what democracy should look like? If yes, then it is important to plot China on that chart as much as you want to plot a Kenya, and see whether we are meeting the standards. And on the basis of that, you can hold China and Kenya responsible. But if we are saying that democracy does not mean the same everywhere, because as China is concerned, as far as they are concerned, so long as there is citizens' welfare, probably that's their own form of democracy. So what is Africa's own type of democracy? My challenge My challenge, my brother, is that we have not sat down as Africans and said, this is our own democracy. So long as we don't sit down and say, this is our own type of democracy, then we are ready to accept whatever is given to us. And as far as I'm concerned, it is copy-paste without modifying. The state formation in Africa, which has been said here, is different from state formation anywhere else. So what will fit in Africa? Why is it that people are too hesitant to embezzle community money, but are celebrated when they embezzle state money? Something is wrong. Where is our loyalty? Perhaps when we answer that question, we are able now to determine the kind of democracy that we want. So, whether we are saying it's backsliding, whether we are saying it is, I think that the most important thing is, what is our citizens saying? Are they happy with the type of governance that we are seeing? My answer is no. Do they have option? Probably no, because even when they go through the elections, they don't get the kind of result they need. So, out of that frustration, any other thing for them works.
I think we need to be careful not to throw away the baby with the bathwater. I think there's a very important questions that have been raised, and this always often comes up in a lot of spaces where we're discussing democracy. And I totally agree that there's a need to interrogate democracy and what it means for Africans. But there's a big difference in terms of interrogating democracy and what it means for Africans, and then saying, oh, democracy as it stands is not working for us. It's an unpopular view, but I really always try to raise that, number one. Number two, I think when we're talking about backsliding, I totally agree. And of course, there are a lot of synonyms that have been used: democratic regression, some that are awful, like decay. But what are we looking at when we talk about that? We're talking about plotting where Africa was post-colonialism, post the Cold War, and where it finds itself here now today. That wave of optimism that we saw during the third wave, and I'll use quotation marks because that can also be debated, the third wave of democratization, which saw the expansion of women's rights, the expansion of social movements and trade unions, has now closed down. We're talking about the closure of civic space right now. Over the past 10, 15 years, we have seen that space narrowing. And practically speaking, when you talk to people, when those Afrobarometer surveys speak to us, they speak about those concerns. These are the average citizens that we're all saying that we're speaking for, right? They talk about their concerns about this narrowing civic space. That, in my view, is democratic regression. We are not where we were post the Cold War and that optimism that we saw. So yes, we can talk about the flaws of democracy. And it's important to talk about the flaws of democracy. We can talk about the inconsistencies and the hypocrisies that we see globally, whether it's the discussions around Chinese influence and Russian influence, or what's happening in the global north with the US and other states. We can talk about all those and unpack them and deal with them. But we also have to speak to the realities of where we find ourselves today. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. I think there was, I'm not going to attempt to respond to the questions on our definition of how we measure regression, backsliding, because I think this has been dealt with. I think there was one question on the narrowing, on the narrow base from which we all should pursue our capital or business interest. I think there's no denying that our economies are small. If you look at different countries on the continent, but what is critical is transparency, the due process. When you have a situation where the bodies that grant access to those opportunities are made up of members of the ruling elite who will opaquely reward tenders, who will opaquely give access to business opportunities to their own, it becomes a problem. it really becomes a problem. Then it becomes that kind of collusion that I was talking about. And this is deliberately structured in such a way to allow access to resources and profit to oil the system. Because if you have an independent player, how easy will it be for those that wield power to then also tap into the pot for the system? So it's deliberately manufactured, engineered with the intentions of entrenching autocracy, of extending the longevity of those that are in power.
All right, so we'll take the next round of questions. Yes, Professor.
Well, I think I have a record for the most spoken participant so far. I'm not sure whether it's a good or a bad record, but I think I would want to draw to your attention, all of those presentations were excellent. And I'm sitting here seeing a thread. We are rising the temperatures in terms of the conversation from when we started to now. And I think we are getting there with the robust conversations that are coming out of this panel. I think, Ngwenya, you actually described Kenya in short. You raised very difficult questions to answer. And my sister there also tries to take us back to rethinking whether we need to rethink the aspect of African democracy. But I think I also want to draw this panel attention to the other panel, which was chaired by Chris. And Chris raised a very important issue about state-nation disjuncture and state formation. And he asked a question that was not answered there, and I think our burden is to carry over this question also to this panel with the trajectory that if states are formed out of external agency, and this is imposed by them, which implies that they did not grow organically, could what we are now seeing here, characterized as typologies of coups, whether you want to talk about them as military coups or electoral coups, could now this be the way in which, on one hand, the state is trying to, in terms of the elites, trying to find themselves organically, and could also be the same thing, could it be true for citizens who are now increasingly supporting state takeover? Why? Because they simply do not have belonging in what they find themselves in this container called the state. There is no aspect of agency and purpose. And so to them, anything that comes could easily replace what they've already considered as bad. So could it be that we need to rethink the state and the nation in Africa? Because typically, I came from Zurich in Switzerland. And what I see there is that I see people who are speaking Swiss mostly. That's an ethnic community. If you go further down the road, River Rhine, you find France, another ethnic community. Next to it there is German and the Italians there. These guys do not have the problems that we seem to have today. So what would be this moral glue that would bring an organic transformation of the African state? And I think I remember in the previous panel where we saw Ambassador Carson, they are talking about Tanzania and Zambia as emerging shining examples of democracy. I scratched myself and asked myself, why Tanzania? And I realized that perhaps Tanzania has something about language that is really acting as a glue for belonging, state formation, and organic transformation. And Tanzanians usually point at Kenya and laugh at us. And they say, in Tanzania, we don't have the idea of Xhosas, Zulus, Kikuyu, Luo, but we call ourselves Tanzania. Now, at the backdrop of that, you find philosophies like Ujamaa. When capitalism was being entrenched in Kenya in the 60s, Ujamaa was emerging in Tanzania as a political philosophy. And Ujamaa slightly slugged Tanzania years back in terms of capital and development, thanks to your story about defending capital and all the clash of capital and business. Well, Tanzania now is proudly united and cohesive, and it's appearing as if it's going to overtake Kenya in terms of development just because of the unity and the peace building that we've witnessed. So Tanzania is a country that seemingly is ahead of us in terms of organic transformation based on fundamental issues that we take for granted, such as language, and our own culture. So could language be, for example, Swahili is now being touted as the language for Africa Union. If everybody would speak the same language, then I think there'll be more convergence than divergence in terms of the conflict pressure points. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for a wonderful presentation. I think your presentations left me with more questions than answers, which is a good thing when you go through a session and you have more questions to tackle. This morning, we spoke about the importance of moving forward from recommendations to real actionable steps. Because a lot of the things that we've discussed and some of what you all have said already, those are conversations that we've been having. Now, I want to pose to all of you on the panel, if you had an opportunity to give one actionable recommendation to a policymaker here on the continent or an international partner on how to engage constructively with partners or governments on looking at feasible pathways towards real transitions that take into account the views of citizens, what could that actionable recommendation be?
Any more questions before we attempt an answer? Right.
Just a very quick question that goes to Ngwenya. You raised a very interesting aspect of democracy and problematization of democracy in Africa, including the notion of entitlement for liberation movements. We have a number of countries in Africa, particularly in East Africa, where we have liberators who fought for the freedom of people. And then I would like to hear from you, what are the recommendations that can you formulate for those people? I'm not going to name countries, but we all know them. What will be your recommendations, strategies to make these people not continue to consider that they are entitled to rule forever, as you put it. So the other aspect is not a question. I'm going to discuss it with Frederick after this meeting, maybe during the break. He was raising the issue of language, that Swahili, one common language, can possibly be used to prevent or mitigate conflicts in Africa. But then the genocide that was committed in Rwanda, we all speak Kinyarwanda. We don't have a second language. We all speak Kinyarwanda. But then genocide was possible. So this kind of contrast. But I'm not asking you a question. We discuss it during the break.
All right. I think I'll kickstart an answer to your question, which is what recommendation would we give policymakers? Mine is very simple, quite abrupt, is that they should stop inviting rogue and corrupt African politicians to the US-Africa Summit. I think that, you know, if I was discussing this with Dr. Eze on the bus when we were coming, that the very people who attend the US-Africa Summit are the ones that are making life uncomfortable for their citizens. Why should you keep inviting them? We need civil society there. We need the real voices of those who matter there in those summits. So that's my simple recommendation.
Thanks. I think some of the questions on practical solutions could have been answered if we had more time in terms of the solutions, because I think I had about 3 that I had jotted. But thanks for bringing that up. And one of the recommendations was really around revisiting regional and international mechanisms around which we could enforce implementation and adoption of democratic norms. And I think there is earlier on, I think I've forgotten the professor who was presenting earlier on, who spoke about the opportunities that are inherently within the AU and how just hold, I think I took some notes. Oh yeah, the African Governance Platform at the AU, how it can be made accessible to citizens. Because one of the challenges that we are having, even when you look at SADC and all these regional bodies, but maybe my brother, Dr. Chuku, can speak eloquently about ECOWAS, is that regional citizens have no means for recourse, especially when they are aggrieved. When you talk about all these electoral disputes in a number of countries, let me talk about SADC itself. How do citizens access SADC for recourse, for instance? And also, I think there are opportunities to make these bodies also serve regional citizens and not become a club of the ruling elites who are actually defending and serving their own interests. And then when it comes to entitlement, it's a difficult one, but I think it all boils down to our political culture. When you look at countries that waged the anti-colonial war, the configuration and characterization of politics, in my own assessment, has been such that independence was the end game, to be free from colonial rule. After independence, there appears, if there was clarity in terms of the roadmap beyond independence, then it wasn't well articulated. And then there was no coherent social contract between those that brought independence and those that they are governing. So in the end, you find that it is in the psyche of the liberators to believe that because we defeated colonial regimes, therefore that's the end of it all. You enjoy what we brought to you. You have no right to discuss and question us on what we do. So I believe this political socialization needs to take place. It's a long game, but I think it's worth it. Looking at all the zones of social politicization that are available, schools, media, faith groups, and so on. We need to believe that participating in politics has to do with your livelihood as well. It should not be that participating in politics is the means to loot the state and to survive. In a number of parliaments that we in the countries that we work in, when you go through even the electoral manifestos of those that are seeking political power, and then you go back after they would have won, you can see that really the intentions are different, the struggles are different. Those that are seeking political office are doing it for themselves so that they get a salary. I mean, it's a fact. They get fat packs. Those that vote them into office, they're investing their hope that their lives would be better. But it doesn't happen that way. How then do you have the power to recall those that we have deployed to fight for you? And all those mechanisms are missing. If they are there, they are not fully implemented and deployed.
When it comes to policymakers, one of my biggest frustrations, and I think this is something that has been repeated everywhere, and is something that citizens, and it's one of the things that leads to the kind of conflict we see, is the inconsistent and hypocritical approach of many international interlocutors, whether it's the US government, whether it's the Brits, whether it's the French. And so my big ask would be that you can't use your own geopolitical interest to trump human rights. And therefore, for example, you cannot support and provide military assistance and support to security forces that abuse their own citizens in the interest of short-term gains when it comes to dealing with the issue of insurgencies and terrorism, for example. And what we have seen is that policy approach has not led to any long-term gains in the first place. In fact, the situation when it comes to insurgencies and terrorism in many of these parts where a lot of money has gone through has failed to address the very issues that they were meant to address. In fact, it's worsened conditions. So my call for policymakers is invest where there are clear human rights frameworks and stop supporting abusive state entities and security forces. I wanted to quickly touch upon the issue of that my brother from Kenya spoke about. You know, I find that very interesting because I always feel that when we talk about organic development, it must always come from within. It cannot be imposed, right? And we have seen these examples, whether it's the fight against colonialism, where there was widespread agreement that we want to dismantle this system. It didn't matter whether you are, whether you are in Malawi, I speak about Malawi, whether you are Malawi, Chewa, Tonga, Yao, Lomwe, as a Malawian. It didn't matter, you wanted to dismantle colonialism. But then we came up with the one-party states. And again, it's the people. Of course, there's always talk about there was a funding for multi-party movements. Yes, there was encouragement from outside, but it's again people who decided to fight against autocracy and say, we want multi-party democracy. We support it. In Malawi, it's the citizens. I was 18. We went out, we ran out there, they were beating us up. We went and voted during the referendum. One-party state or multi-party democracy. We voted for it. It came from within. The end of apartheid, there was no one who said, although there were external forces and the Afrikaner government was seeking to take advantage of ethnic divisions, but it was Xhosa, it was Sotho, it was Tswana, it was Zulu who came together to end apartheid. So I think sometimes we have to kind of interrogate, again, these types of issues. Where are these ethnic divisions coming from? Are they really coming from within? And can we really rewrite our borders? I don't think we can anymore. So we have to deal with what we're given, but it has to come from within.
So, Fred, what they are telling you is that language alone does not make a state homogeneous, you know, and diversity is not a source of conflict. So we need to rethink that your approach before we can adopt it. So probably is a pathway to research for you, you know. So probably there is something more than just language that is making Tanzania now as an example. But okay, I thought we were, in the course of our presentation, I thought we were also making reference to some of the things that we prefer. The question is, which one can the US, for example, take on, you know, in all honesty? So we've talked about the Security Council. If you look at it critically, what President Yahya Jammeh did is the same thing that President Trump did. They lost the election and didn't want to leave power. ECOWAS did not wait for the UN to address the issue of Yahya Jammeh. So how do we begin to strengthen the structures of power and even cohesion within Africa? The African Standby Force has been sitting down for a very long time. So it's not a deterrence to corrupt or autocratic leaders or those who want to perpetuate themselves in power. It's not. In any case, who are those to contribute to the standing force? So it was funny. I think East Africa used Museveni as a mediator to go and mediate term limit in Burundi. So the second thing is our normative framework needs to change. There are certain things that we have seen on the basis of consistency that these are avenues, pathways to military incursion or instability in Africa. Term limit is one of them. The ambiguity in term limit, the lack of clarity, is one sure way that has been established that will lead to either instability or military incursion. So, as continental institution coming together under REX, we need to review our protocols on democracy and good governance. And one of the appendix should be a clear definition of term limit. But people have also argued that it's also important, and yesterday it was said clearly, that especially beginning with the Security Council, can they hold themselves accountable? What is the engagement of France? What is the engagement of US? What is the engagement of Russia? What is the engagement of all the members of Security Council in Africa? Where it becomes exploitative, can the four tell the one of them, using their collective action to say what you're doing in Africa is bad? Those are the questions that people are beginning to ask. But let me also say that it will also be unfortunate if the international superpowers are not aware that there is a new awakening in Africa. This confrontation will go on for a while. It's important that this is understood, and then we have a new method of dialogue and engagement. Otherwise, if the approach is still this master-servant, colonial power, helping receiver, then there will be a serious problem going forward. Those of them in West Africa countries are beginning to say it clearly, and they are not missing words, including even saying that they can come together to fight the entire ECOWAS if you dare disrupt this movement. So what kind of new engagement do we need to see? We cannot say that Africa has come to a point where we will stand alone. No. But can we change this partnership so that indeed it is partnership? If you are dropping resources to sustain democracy in Africa, to sustain peace in Africa, are we looking at it as just an assistance, or that which works the way climate change, Ozo and Co have made climate change to work, which is global climate change, global peace and security? It doesn't matter where it is starting from or where it is going to. We all know that everybody is affected. So all this idea of, look at how many civil society organizations are sustained in Africa today. By the time you finish writing log frame, the whole thing you want to resolve is gone. So we need to have a new way of, and I think that's what Dr. Edem said when she said, can the US-Africa summit be more people-centric? So that the US understand what African citizens are saying. You can't take the same people we are accusing to go and now determine our future. In any case, you are legitimizing even the topic of discussion. You are legitimizing those we are calling illegitimate at home. So that's a problem for Africa already. So I think we have listed a couple of ideas. The critical question is, which one can we sincerely take on? especially as it relates to engagement with Africa. Not just from US, but how US now addresses its peers within the Security Council.
Did you want to close our session for us? Great.
But I also wanted to take on what Zambala said. Sorry. I don't know whether you heard yourself, but I've written on it just once. You called for, tacitly you have called for good conditional aid, conditionality, because you said that the investors should take us to task. But this is supporting what is good, but we are going on the issue of aid conditionality there, which is again is a treacherous area.
No, I think I have to be very specific on that. That is military support, which is very, very specific and different from aid.
Because you are touching something there.
No.
Fine, thanks.
Military support and assistance.
All right. Do we have any more burning questions or comments? We've gone past our time anyway. I think we've had one of the most interesting discussion and panel, and thank you very much for coming through for us. You've left us with more questions to keep pondering over. I think that as we don't have many days left, but as we go back, for me especially, going back to where I come from, there's a lot that I'm taking away from the discussions that we've had here. I have worked at CDD for many years, 25 years actually, although I don't look it. I keep saying that, we've been working at this experiment we call democracy for so long. Each day, each year, it seems like it's a new project that we have to tackle. There are new issues to deal with. But like I said on Monday, democracy is not an event. It is a process. We'll keep at it. What do they say? Is it a luta continua, right? A luta continua. Thank you very much.